Morning everybody, thank you very much for joining me here today for my talk on the subject of low carb for weight loss, specifically what we are told about it, in this instance by the New Zealand Ministry of Health, and why we are told what we are told about it. Some disclosures just before we begin. While I do have certificates in health and nutrition coaching from Precure, I am not applying them professionally at this time, so I am not a health professional, nor am I an academic. What I am is the author of a book called The Fat Ginger Nerd, and as the subtitle of the book suggests, it is very much largely the story of my own personal weight loss journey. A journey that began to get kind of interesting at this time about 7 or so years ago. If you've ever wondered just what a fat ginger nerd actually looks like, this is in effect the old me, and believe it or not, this is actually not me at my heaviest. At my heaviest I was 137 kilograms. In this photo I'm only 132. But the reason I use this photo here is because the very week this photo was taken, and nobody else but me knew this at the time, I had just committed to trying a low carb diet to lose weight for the first time. I was not at all convinced necessarily that it would do anything for me. I was very, very skeptical, but I went ahead with it anyway. And what happened? This happened. This is my weight loss chart, 2015 through 2017. You can see I'd lost a little bit of weight beforehand, but then once the low carb kicks in, that's when things really started to take off. And so over that 15-month period, October 2015 through to end of December 2016, I went on to lose another 50 kilograms and arrived at a goal weight by the very end of 2016 of just 82 kilograms. Now, in this particular photo, I'm not quite there yet. Technically, I'm still at 86, but again, there's a certain significance to this particular photo. We can, of course, line it up with the previous one. These are my before and afters, or at least the closest thing to it. This is the same person in the same spot, 12 months removed, 46 kilograms removed in those 12 months. That's over 100 pounds lost in a year, and all of that weight has stayed off so far for another 6 years and counting. So it's been an interesting time for me, right, these last few years as I sort of adjust to life as a normal-sized human being for pretty much the first time ever. But along the way, as of late, I can't help but find myself wondering increasingly frequently. I have this sort of question lurking away in the back of my mind, and it won't go away. And it's an understandable question, right? Given my experience and what it's done for me, how is it that this low-carb thing is not more widely known, /understood, /accepted than it currently is? And so in order to get to the bottom of this issue, I thought what I would do is start right at the very top with a look at New Zealand's dietary guidelines. So these were published in 2020, December 2020, and the summary statements, if you like, of these guidelines are all about emphasising the importance of things like fruits, vegetables, grains, lean meat, if any, these days. Saturated fat is still seen as being some sort of nutritional devil, as it were. So there are a lot of clear incompatibilities to varying degrees with several aspects of what might be considered a typical low-carb diet and several aspects of what the guidelines are actually recommending, even if low carb itself is not being directly acknowledged as such within the guidelines themselves. Where we do see a direct acknowledgement of the low-carb diet in New Zealand health policy is in a document of what the Ministry calls Topical Questions and Answers, published back in 2015. It's still on their website today. And it just sort of sits beside and underneath the dietary guidelines themselves. And amongst the various questions they ask in this document is this one, which says, is a low-carb diet the best way to lose weight? And we're going to have a look at some of the elements of their particular answer to this question. The short version of this answer is, well, no. The Ministry says it's all about the energy in a diet that's important, and not so much about the types of foods that energy comes from, and they sort of restate that a little bit further down as well. It's not about the macronutrients, it's more about the energy balance alone. Okay, with that in mind, let's now take a look at some science. Here is a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials comparing a range of low-carb and low-fat style diets for the purpose of weight loss. Each of the bubbles we see on each of these graphs represents an individual trial. Each of these trials ran for a minimum length of 6 months. And the way to read these graphs is that the vertical axis represents the amount of weight that is lost, which increases as you go down. So the lower the bubble, or the lower the line, the greater the weight loss. So what are we looking at exactly with each of these 4 graphs? Well, the one on the top left is calories. It's energy. And really the thing that stands out the most to me about the graph on the top left is that, well, nothing really stands out to me about the graph on the top left. The bubbles are all over the place. There's practically no pattern to speak of. The line, if anything, is trending ever so slightly perhaps in the opposite direction to what we might expect if the ministry's position statement on low carb for weight loss was true, that it was actually all about energy balance alone, because that's not what the data suggests. If their statement was really true, we might perhaps expect the graph on the top left to maybe look a little bit more like, say, the graph on the top right. Only what's the graph on the top right tracking? It's carbohydrate. As carbs are proportionally reduced in the diet, we see weight loss tends to increase. And very clearly the opposite pattern is true along the bottom left and right there for fat and protein respectively. As fat and as protein are proportionally increased in the diet, so too tends to be the weight loss. So while this doesn't necessarily go as far as dispelling the idea of calories and energy balance entirely, it does seem to suggest at least that when it comes to weight loss, it's just not that simple. Some calories do seem to matter more than others. The next part of the ministry's statement, and you'll notice how this one's kind of buried in the middle of it here, they actually do acknowledge that, well, some people can lose some weight on some low-carb diets sometimes, but this happens with other diets as well, and let's acknowledge and accept that people can and do lose weight with a variety of dietary patterns. There's no shortage of evidence to suggest that. Here is another meta-analysis of randomised controlled trials comparing low carb to a range of other dietary patterns, including the pattern of no diet at all, if that somehow counts. And there are numbers here for 6 months and 12 months. Low carb is clearly the number one option after 6 months. It's less of a clear winner after 12 months, but it is still at least very clearly in the top 2. It's right up there alongside low fat as the best 2 of these 5 options for weight loss. And so the findings here are very much reflected in the conclusions at the bottom, where they're saying that these numbers very much support the practice of recommending any diet that a patient will adhere to in order to lose weight, which surely on the basis of these numbers one would think would include low carb as an option. The ministry then goes on to say, and this is important, that there is no evidence of the long-term benefits or safety of such diets. And so immediately in my mind that brings to mind the question of, well, what do they mean exactly by long-term? How long-term can we go in terms of meta-analyses of RCTs? We've seen 6-month data, we've seen 12-month data. Can we go any long-term than that? Turns out we can. Here's another meta-analysis of randomised controlled trials. It's quite a new one, came out just earlier this year, 2022. A lot of various RCTs, again, comparing low carb and low fat for weight loss. And they're grouped into various time brackets. So the ones at the top are 6 to 11 months, the ones further down are 12 to 23, and the ones at the bottom, which I've highlighted, are RCTs looking specifically at low carb for weight loss that have run for a full 2 years. And again, much like the numbers we saw in the previous study, low carb is not quite perhaps a clear winner in this one, but that by no means suggests that it's a clear loser either. It's up there, right? It's competing well with your more standard contemporary low-fat style dietary advice. Certainly enough in my mind to suggest that low carb can and ought to be considered at least an option for long-term weight loss for up to 2 years. And yet in spite of all this, based on all the current evidence, the Ministry of Health does not recommend low-carb diets for weight loss. So given the science we've seen so far here today, and with my own experience on top of that, I can't help but feel really confused at this point in the exercise. I kind of want to understand more about the Ministry's point of view here. Where are they coming from? What is the basis for the Ministry of Health's claim of a lack of evidence of low-carb for weight loss? So at this point, I start to pivot towards trying to understand how New Zealand's dietary guidelines are put together. And there are 4 key evidence sources that they look to as far as their position on evidence for dietary patterns and body weight outcomes. They're listed on the right-hand side here, and I've highlighted the first 3 of these sources because I do want to make the point here that these first 3 evidence sources are not so much reviews of the evidence itself, as they are kind of a step removed from those reviews. They're like almost second-hand information. They're interpretations, if you like, of underlying reviews of the evidence. But because they're being used, in effect, as sort of hard evidence sources in this way, then you could almost describe New Zealand's dietary guidelines as functioning kind of like an interpretation of other interpretations of reviews of the evidence, right? So at this point, we're quite some way removed from the underlying evidence itself. Now you might think, maybe I'm overstating my case. What are the harms? What are the risks? What are the issues really with relying on these sorts of end product dietary guideline documents, as I might call them? Well, I can give you an example from Australia. This is not from the 2013 Australian Dietary Guidelines themselves. This is from the 2011 review that was conducted in the build-up to the publication of those 2013 guidelines. And I've highlighted the bits of interest that I found here, where they acknowledge that there is something of a relative lack of evidence from what they call Level 1 and Level 2 studies, which in the context of this review basically means they're talking about trials. And much of the evidence in this space is observational, especially from prospective cohort studies, which are a lesser grade of quality of evidence, if you like. Okay, but what do they then go and do with this understanding? Well, in some cases, when assessing the overall evidence base used to establish grades for the evidence statements, a rating of excellent has been given, even when only Level 3 studies are available. Level 3 studies being your cohort studies, these are observational studies. Now, is it ever really appropriate, in absolute terms, for any sort of evidence statement to be given a grade of excellent on the basis of observational evidence only? I wouldn't necessarily have thought so, but that's what happened here in 2011. The flow-on effects of this make it through, of course, into the 2013 Australian guidelines, which in turn the New Zealand Ministry of Health are only too happy to pick up and run with at this level and think, sure, let's just go ahead and do what they've done. So these are the sorts of issues that aren't necessarily so immediately apparent at this level of things. We have to look behind these end product documents and look to the reviews of the evidence that sit behind these dietary recommendations. And so that brings us to the fourth of these four evidence sources. So this is not the 2015 American Dietary Guidelines themselves. This is the 2014 review conducted by the USDA in the lead up to the publication of those guidelines. And since they are looking directly at this review, we can take a closer look at some of the details of this particular review. So here's the cover page for the PDF. All this information is freely available online, by the way. Anyone else is more than welcome to replicate or to challenge anything that I'm presenting here today. So the section of this particular review in 2014 dealing with outcomes of dietary patterns for body weight, etc., consisted of a set of four questions that the committee posed. And they're all slightly different, but broadly speaking, the theme is pretty much the same, right? It's all about trying to understand the relationship between what we eat and what we weigh. And so in response to each of these questions, what the committee did was they searched for a range of studies across a range of scientific databases, and then they subjected all of their findings to a range of what are called eligibility criteria. And this, as I understand it, is pretty much par for the course as far as these sorts of reviews go, right? This is just about ensuring a sort of minimum set of consistent standards, if you like, about the body of evidence that they're looking to assess as part of this review. Now, there is a bit of a list here, and unfortunately we don't have the time to go through them all today, but there are a couple that I do just want to highlight very briefly. One is that in order for a study to be included within this review, it needed to feature a description of the dietary patterns being consumed by its subjects. It turns out what they mean by this is a description by way of contemporary food groups. So if, for example, you want to do a study on something like the Mediterranean diet, your write-up after the fact would have to say, we fed our subjects a diet of fruits, vegetables, grains, lean meat, nuts and seeds, olive oil, etc., right? There's your description of your dietary pattern. There's a tick for this eligibility criteria, no problem. But have a think about how we might tend to describe the low-carb diet in the literature. A number of the studies I've read tend to characterise it by way of the distribution of the macronutrients. We fed our subjects a diet of 20% carbs, for example. Well, that doesn't necessarily count as a description of your dietary pattern. So here's a possible failure of one of these eligibility criteria, and therefore a possible reason for why a lot of low-carb science is not necessarily going to feature in the outcomes of this review. The other criteria that stood out to me, it was interesting, it was kind of expressed in two different ways. It counts on one hand both as an inclusion criteria and its effective opposite is also an exclusion criteria. But basically you put the two of them together here, and what the committee is saying is we're really only interested in studies on healthy people. Studies on people with any sort of chronic health condition or disease diagnosis, etc., are not going to be considered as part of this review. And again, there's a potential problem when you think about a lot of low-carb science that we're aware of, remembering that many of these studies tend to be conducted on people with chronic health issues, things like obesity, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, and so on and so forth. Things that we know are caused by a poor diet, but at the same time, since they can also reasonably be considered disease diagnoses as health conditions in this way, then here's another failure potentially of one of these eligibility criteria, and therefore another likely reason for why a lot of low-carb science is not necessarily going to feature in the outcomes of this review. Then I found something about this review that I have to say I did not expect to find at all. And once I realised what I was looking at here, I was genuinely shocked. This is a list of the actual dietary patterns themselves that the committee searched for in response to the questions we saw a few slides earlier. So this is just taking a step back for a moment from those eligibility criteria we've looked at, and we're just looking at the actual search terms that the committee used to retrieve the body of evidence that they were then looking to filter through these eligibility criteria. It's a bit of a wall of text, but basically they've gone repeatedly, wherever they can, to go looking over and over for evidence on certain dietary patterns, right? They've gone looking for Mediterranean, they've gone looking for DASH, they've gone looking for vegan, they've gone looking for vegetarian, and so on. And to be clear, you know, we want people to be conducting a broad range of searches across a broad range of sources, etc. There's really not much wrong necessarily with what we're seeing on the slide, but perhaps, just perhaps, there might be something wrong, say, with what we're not seeing on the slide, right? How many examples do we see here of any attempts on the part of the review committee to go searching for anything in the realm of, say, low carb or keto or paleo or carnivore? They're just not there. So regardless of any potential issues we might be considering with some of these eligibility criteria we saw earlier, it turns out that ultimately the reason why practically no low-carb science was going to be featured in this section of this review at all was because the committee never even actually searched for any of that science in the first place. And again, once I realised that this is what I was looking at here, I was absolutely blown away. It therefore comes as no surprise, perhaps, to realise that the conclusions coming out of this section of this review very much reflected several of the aspects of the very dietary patterns, of course, that they did search for. So, of course, they're going to conclude that what's important here are your fruits, your vegetables, your grains, your lean meat, if any, saturated fat is still the devil, and of course at this point it's not too hard to see how the dots connect, how the flow of information works in terms of what gets said in turn within New Zealand's own dietary guidelines. So when we come back to this original position statement that set us off on our little journey to Wonderland here today, we can sort of understand, perhaps, we can look at what the Ministry of Health is saying here with a better understanding of their point of view of how they're arriving at these particular conclusions, even if perhaps we're left with some pretty hard questions, perhaps in need of some pretty hard answers where some of the underlying methodologies are concerned. So, some food for thought as we look to wrap this up. The Ministry's Q&A on low carb, you recall that document, it was actually originally published in 2015, but it's still there on the website today, 7 years later. Much of the science we've seen here today is a lot newer than 2015. What if we were to ask the question again in 2022? Would the answer to that question perhaps be a little bit different then? Is the question itself even appropriate? You recall it asked if low carb was the best way to lose weight. Or what if instead we framed it in such a way that asked, is low carb at least a viable option to lose weight? Would the answer to the question perhaps be a little bit different then? There's also this issue of the burden of proof, right? I mean, if low carb is required to be subjected to any certain given level of scientific scrutiny, then let's please be consistent about applying that same level of scrutiny to any and all other dietary patterns. Of course, we're going to conclude that there's no evidence for low carb when you don't even go looking for that evidence in the first place. And as far as the issue of what is long term is concerned, Well, you can flip that on its head as well and ask, well, how many long-term studies are there, by whatever definition you care to name, that support the standard recommendations as they exist currently? There might not be so many of those either, depending on the definitions. And finally, with regard to the eligibility criteria before, where we learned that it was really just about studies on healthy people that the review committee were interested in, it would seem that by extension the effective scope of New Zealand's own dietary guidelines would not therefore extend to the subject of weight loss, or indeed to anybody with any sort of chronic metabolic issue. So therefore, why would we ever advise on what to do for weight loss by simply telling people to follow the dietary guidelines that don't consider the evidence on the very issue from which they are suffering? Do we need to perhaps be a little bit more transparent about the actual scope of our dietary guidelines? Do we perhaps in turn need to maybe even consider a separate set of guidelines for people with chronic metabolic issues, for people with, for example, weight to lose? Well, would it interest you to know that in New Zealand such a document actually exists? And I swear I'm nearly finished. This won't take long, I promise. Clinical Guidelines for Weight Management in New Zealand Adults. When I first found this document, I was actually really excited. I thought, yes, if only something like this had existed when I was struggling so long back in the day. So I went straight in to have a look. What's the very first bullet point say in this document? Eat less. Particularly of energy-dense foods. So they're right back to this energy balance line above all else, literally the top of this very list. What does the rest of this list say? Well, we see fruits, we see vegetables, we see grains, we see lean meat if any, saturated fat is still the devil. I don't know about you, but a lot of this sounds pretty familiar at this point, right? In fact, it sounds an awful lot like the standard dietary guidelines. So, I'll leave it there, I'll rest my case. This has been my take on the subject of low carb for weight loss, what we are told and why. I hope you found it interesting, and thank you for your time.